She's been a policy coordinator at UCL's Public Policy Unit and been involved with projects with the Museum of London Archaeology called CAPE and things like that, and has worked for Historic England and UNESCO, etc., etc., etc. All lots of cool and exciting stuff. And so today she's going to talk to us. Is this the same title? Is it different? The one I've got is From Global to Local, exploring the importance of local knowledge and climate action. Is that right?
Yeah.
I got that right. Perfect. Right. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to you, Hannah. So take it away.
Yeah. Okay. So hello, everyone, and thanks for having me as part of the series. So I'm just going to dive straight into the talk, which is, essentially on the value of local knowledge. But I do want to add here, just in case time is pressed, if anyone would like to get in touch with me about anything that I've mentioned and it doesn't come up in questions, please do. So just really briefly, Ed had mentioned it, but I have worked across different organizations in different capacities, but all related to broadly sustainability and climate change, climate action, and things like capacity building, which has really put a clear kind of insight on what it means to translate research into practice, into processes, into the infrastructure, and also within policy. So that's kind of what I'm talking about today. Okay, I'm going to start by zooming back a bit as a reminder of the landscape that we're really looking at here, and bring us back to global challenges. We used to hear a lot about this sort of concept, this word, which is kind of, it's in decline, I guess, in a way. But global challenges for me is about accepting or suggesting in the first instance, whichever way you kind of want to look at it, that there is somehow a global nature to all of these major problems that we're living in. And then there's a sort of suggestion implicit in that it's a result of some broken aspect of global cities, systems. But what that quite is, we don't know yet, or rather we don't want to know, or we don't want to poke at. But regardless, that brokenness is having huge implications to all of our social, political, environmental, and economic systems and institutions that are in place. But it's these systems and institutions which are both part of the problem and part of the solution. And currently our, I guess you could say, problem-solving mechanisms that are in place simply were and are not designed to cope with the scale, the scope, the speed of many of the concerns and challenges, let alone the complexity and the entanglement, the cascading impacts between all of these challenges. So what I'm sort of saying is that I really don't feel that there's a community, and what I mean by community is like whether it's the scientific, government, public, or whoever it is that can realistically cope with these major problems in isolation. And we simply don't have the systems in place, nor the tools, nor maybe we could even argue the right mindsets in place to tackle these challenges unless we work in partnerships. And I just wanted to flag, so that sometimes like global challenges are narrowed down and understood differently into things like megatrends. And here on the slide, this is part of an EU project that was looking at emerging global shifts and how those shifts impact culture and heritage, and what is really kind of coming out at the forefront of some of the major challenges that we're going to see moving forward. So of course there's, and I think these are very kind of evident these days, but world dynamics, those power dynamics, renewed tensions and value-based allegiances and shifts in powerhouses, inflation, so demand, supply, these increasing kind of things like energy and resource securities, and the implications that those resource concerns have to things like national debt, trade, industries, and so on. Of course, we see the fourth industrial revolution, so that digital revolution of interconnectivity, automation, AI, the implications that rapid change has to political, social patterns and processes. And of course, there's climate change and the vast impact that has and will continue to have on everything. And amongst that, also the revitalization, I guess you could say, of polarized value systems and how tolerance and intolerances are feeding into policy, reform, governance, democratic pursuits, and so forth. And wrapped up all together, we have the ongoing inequalities and inequities. And these things are very much at the forefront and playing a huge role on a lot of strategic agendas and research agendas. And also, of course, just more popularly, a way to see global challenges is through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this approach focuses on partnership to address these issues through Goal 17, one of the key but very kind of underrated goals. But the SDGs are very clearly driven by a kind of capitalist market economy as the system that's in place and will remain in place, and it plays a central role in how we achieve all of the other goals. And the reason I like zooming out to global challenges and SDGs is because it does remind us of how entangled and interconnected all of these issues are, whatever we choose to focus on. And actually is like our environment and ways of thinking, and it really kind of plays into our ways of thinking about climate change in particular. So this is what we have in store in the UK, according to the Met Office. You may have heard this many times before. So a few things to expect include increasing summer temperatures, more extreme weather, rising sea levels, intense storms, varying seasonal changes, and of course the sort of those direct hazards, but also indirect manifestations, so floods, issues with crops, drought, and so forth. And of course, we already are seeing these impacts here and around the world. And this is just another one of the many reports that come out annually. This is the Met Office's State of the UK climate, and this one is published in July 2024. So some takeaways are that 2023 was the second warmest year on record for the UK since 1884, and one of the wettest. So there's a lot of like superlatives and records being set these days. And of course, just some of them that we see in the UK. These are all photos from the UK as well. It's droughts, floods, landslides, loss of habitats like meadows, heat waves, wildfires, invasive species, crop failures, coastal erosion, warning of falling numbers in plants and vertebrates, peatland deterioration, threatening woodland benefits, and so forth. Or more recently on the news from a few days ago is that the global sea ice is at a record low. And as we know that like there's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so the IPCC reports continue to assess the state of climate change across the world with increasing confidence. They're now telling us a very clear message that climate change is happening now, with risk and impact evidenced around the world, setting record upon record. And so the science is and has been clear that any further delay in concerted global action will miss a very brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So then we really have to ask the question, what is the problem? Why has there been no resolve after 50 years of this warning? We've been hearing it for a very long time. So there is, of course, a lot of barriers when it comes to action. And I do think that what we tend to see is a difference between what people say, so their attitudes or personal or cultural values or worldviews, versus what they actually do. So how do we translate this interest or this passion or the marketing into making real change in our lives, which that change could be, you know, an inconvenience at best, or it might even require some serious life-changing or behavioral, financial decisions and compromises at the more extreme end. And that's really a kind of core strategy of thinking behind environmental policy progression. We need to understand how to bridge the value action gap that exists, and in that also rethink our capabilities and our capacity across the board. And I do think here that understanding heritage can certainly help. So my work focuses on how heritage can help better understand people and communities, and how heritage can help build capacity and climate resilience, or even how culture can act as maybe like an obstructor to climate action. So I put a few pointers of what it means to work in or with heritage, just in case. So heritage covers a huge area, and it's a complex concept. A lot of people assume, you know, who might not work with the past, it assumes that the focus is on the built environment or some sort of material culture, whether it's Buckingham Palace or Stonehenge or something like that. But it actually does span across so much more and is central to our ways of knowing or our ways of reinventing ourselves. Heritage can be about process, about legacies and practices. It could be about reconciliation, peace, and conflict, and working with communities to understand things like justices or historical injustices, values, and how the ongoing processes of extractive and exploitative empires, imperialism, governments, and systems have and continue to have impact on people, on local communities, and of course on indigenous peoples as well. UNESCO, for example, understands heritage as our legacy from the past, what we live with today, and what we pass on to future generations. And this includes both natural and cultural heritage, intangible and tangible, which are, of course, like interconnected. So just briefly, we can understand natural heritage as those kind of components of the natural environment, including whether it's fauna, flora, ecosystems, natural features, geological and physiographical formations or structures, and it includes natural sites of value from the point of view of communities, through whether it's scientific, spiritual, historic, aesthetic, or other kind of forms of social significances. And of course, natural heritage also supports biodiversity in human systems and can be natural resources as well. And then, of course, you have cultural heritage, which is more kind of tangible and intangible expressions related to ways of living developed by community or society, so inherited from past generations. And just again to quote UNESCO, in its broadest sense, it's both a product and a process of communities and societies, which provides them with a wealth of resources that are inherited from the past, created in the present, and bestowed for the benefit of future generations. But most importantly for me, I really feel the heritage sector, through its understanding of things such as tradition or sustainable ways of knowing and practices, power dynamics and historical legacies and tensions, areas of trust and distrust among communities, and that sort of like understanding of local values and practices, that has a lot to offer in terms of people-centered climate resilience, but also understanding what climate impact is in the first state, and what people see as risk. So it really is at the heart of understanding communities, and helps to kind of create and unpick those stories and narratives at the heart of communities, and along their relationship with the climate change that they see happening within their immediate environments. So moving on to climate heritage. climate heritage is as a term used by some to talk about research and practice looking into climate change and heritage. But it really is about humans as a main influence on the state of the world and how heritage can help resolve these and resolve in terms of even just understanding what sort of alternative futures there might be, or also just how people can cope with change. And so there are 5 messaging points that were put forward. This was when I was working in historic England, to where heritage can contribute towards climate change proactively. So it's just worth going through them. So 1, our environment has co-evolved through complex interactions with human activity, and that this is something understanding the past, archaeology and so forth can help further understand. 2, heritage is an enabler to a sustainable future through basically a sort of systemic understanding based on it being interdisciplinary and able to better understand correlations and connectedness between wider social, political, economic, and environmental factors. The 3rd, knowledge of the past as well as past practices being used to improve sustainable decisions, and this can be anything from land and water management practices to practical ways towards things like resource efficiency. The 4th, by understanding the historic environment, it's an integrated approach, and again, this is pointing to its interdisciplinary nature and capacity to understand these kind of entanglements across time and space. And lastly, that heritage is a natural and accessible provider of needed narratives, climate change narratives, which can provide these hooks and that personal connection for framing some of these difficult conversations, decisions, and actions. And so this slide is just a way to sort of categorize our wider abilities as whether we're researchers or practitioners, which is useful as an accessible way to kind of break down ways to approach climate change, or it's like more operational. So we have mitigation, threat and opportunity, adaptation, thinking about deep time and futures, and advocacy. And then of course, like the messaging and the comms is just so important in all of the work that we do, anything related to sustainability, whether it's climate action or even like EDI related things. So just quite quickly to tease out some of those strands. So we have mitigation, which is about reducing carbon emissions and that move towards net zero as quickly as possible. That's about the contribution of the historic environment for a low carbon future and ensuring that that is also well understood and realized. So this sort of would include things like understanding embodied carbon. This is very much something that historic England and local governments are looking at in terms of like planning. So understanding energy efficiency, carbon sequestration, renewable energy, but again, taking that people-centered understanding and approach and understanding like the nuances as well, and what being adaptive to some of the challenges looks like. Threats and opportunities, so this is thinking about gaps in our knowledge and how we can translate hazards, for example, into risks by understanding, again, the nuances related to vulnerability differences across heritage assets and regions, but also thinking about where the probability of risk and consequences relate to people and habitats. So like it could kind of include perceptions and people's responses that can be a part of understanding basically risk and opportunity, threat and opportunity. And so for adaptation, these might be like ideas of how to adapt to future climate scenarios. This is a much more complex area, and it's about being kind of reflexive and flexible. And it's so important, but it's only really just started to be prioritized, largely because it's really difficult to set indicators and metrics for this. But it is about, you know, our offer about kind of getting that social context, the social element, and thinking about how our understanding or even our methodologies in the heritage space being like thinking about those methodologies and how they can be key for thinking about wider benefits, community participation, and what works well. We have the capacity to learn from the past. That's really about thinking how we can learn from our, I guess you could say, pre-carbon past, so before our reliance on cheap carbon intensive fuel, such as coal or gas. I guess not cheap that these days, but coal, gas, petrol, and thinking about different traditional skills that may or may not be sustainable, and having that kind of archaeological research that shows what impact human activity can have on places over long periods of time, and having those insights at hand when we think about things like land management, building design, like fabrics, construction, and of course, learning from our past or reflecting on it can highlight, again, these like injustices and exclusion and legacies and those previous and ongoing practices and processes, which can really give us a sort of stronger hand when we think about what works, what doesn't, and understanding why things do or don't get implemented properly. And then, of course, lastly, it's about engaging with policy. So basically, if you want to say that the future is full of uncertainty and that we can't predict it, is really important to think and develop policies that can actually cope with a range of different scenarios, outcomes, and be flexible enough to adapt to changing situations, but also what your fight is, what your ask is, and what your push is, what to really understand the sort of more policy landscape that you're working within. Okay, so how can people who work in heritage then, what can they do? How can they help? And so I just want to talk about this project that I worked on as scientific investigator. And for short, it's called ICSM. I'll use that further on, CHC, which stands for the International Co-Sponsored Meeting on Culture, Heritage, and Climate Change. So for this, the co-sponsors were UNESCO, the IPCC, and ICOMOS. So really working across culture and I guess like climate change scientists and so forth. But it was also partnered with the IUCN, so Union for Conservation of Nature, very much brought that in. CIPRID, which is a group of indigenous peoples like represented there, and then ICLEI, which is local government, and those were partners. So not only did the project aim to strengthen relations between all of these organizations and working on heritage and climate change, as recommended actually at the 2016 UNESCO World Heritage Convention, but it also aimed basically to take stock of the state of knowledge and identify gaps in 3 themes, which I put on the slide. So systemic connections of culture, heritage, and climate change, and that was known as the knowledge systems theme. Loss, damage, and adaptation for culture and heritage, and that was known as the impacts theme actually. And then the roles of culture and heritage in transformative change and alternative sustainable futures, and that was labeled the solutions theme. So we held a 5-day meeting with individuals representing some 40 countries across 6 continents, with 40% of those participants coming from the global south. We had about 100 individuals as part of this. And then, yeah, I think I mentioned across the three themes, we had those two cross-cutting themes, which was cultural governance and the capacity to learn from the past. Now, just in terms of outputs, so we had quite a few people involved in this whole process. So we produced 3 white papers, which were authored by an international and diverse team. And they focused on those 3 themes I mentioned, so knowledge systems, impacts, and solutions. And actually, these are fantastic kind of just sort of a sort of literature review, but also state of play on what is going on across those themes. And if you're interested, they are online and really do an amazing job in delving into them. But we also wrote a global research and action agenda, or GRA, as we called it, on culture, heritage, and climate change, which pulled out these kind of key knowledge gaps and messages as pointers for policy and decision makers, or anyone that wanted, researchers and practitioners. And the way we see this report is that it can be used flexibly and dynamically for its relevance and application across local and national context. So this is very much like high-level global, and the GRA actually was almost pretty much co-authored by the 100 people who contributed to the 5-day event, and then by the steering committee. And one of the things that we really tried to do, it doesn't have a single peer-reviewed reference in there. They are all, while they're kind of credible sources, they are about how you use and extract local knowledge as well, and sort of elevate it in a way, or put it on an even footing with a lot of the other sort of peer-reviewed scientific publications, and I could talk more about that later if anyone's interested. But its main mission basically was to draw together what we consider 3 knowledge systems and allow for that recognition and autonomy of each on a level playing field. So, like, recognizing that each for their own distinctiveness, to be woven together to co-create stronger understandings of and responses to the challenges that we face. And this really is the key point in terms of embedding communities into climate actions and principles. So the 3 knowledge systems you'll see on the slide is like scientific, indigenous, and local communities. And we had actually used the term integrated, and we got, of course, rightly so, a lot of pushback. So the way that it was then visualized is that these knowledge systems have to be pulled together without losing their distinctiveness and be basically like a braid woven. And I kind of want to draw on 3 key messages. So at the heart of the agenda, we collate evidence demonstrating the relevance of culture and heritage in climate discussions, and highlight just how critical culture and heritage are to understanding, responding to, and creating action for climate change. And we use different forms of evidence to highlight its importance in decision-making and planning, and what it means for equitable inclusion, what that looks like of diverse actors and groups, communities, and people who are in research, practice, and decision-making. And I guess like one of the main things I realized is we really highlight the reality of inequity and inaccessibility, and the need to identify how systems, in fact, reinforce these inequalities. And maybe we can even dive deeper. It's people are part of the system making that perpetuates these inequalities and creates barriers for potential opportunities for these meaningful transformations across whether it's mindsets, values, and systems. Yeah, and here's just a few kind of, I guess, headliner points that were pulled out from the report. So climate and culture collaborations should start with the premise that all voices and knowledge systems are equally valuable in terms of the role, function, distinctiveness, and contribution to addressing climate change and emerging problems. And that there is a need to proactively acknowledge, translate, incorporate, and use different forms of data and evidence so that it can kind of include whether it's the social, the cultural, the spiritual, the natural dimensions, and really make an effort to avoid these sort of silo-style understandings and analyses that we see related to climate action and practice. And it also helps improve and develop holistic, equitable, and inclusive evidence-based policy. And just to flag that the impacts white paper really touches on the biases of how we understand climate change based on where resources, funding, and I guess like priorities are put worldwide. So you would get a lot more understanding of climate impact in one region over another, and a lot more kind of recognition based on whether it's peer-reviewed publications and so forth, at the expense of a lot of local communities who are actually equally taking sort of robust and credible measurements of the change that they're seeing in their communities. And then we have the importance of embedding more understanding, recognition, and acknowledgement of culture and heritage into climate change thinking. So even our methods in, I guess, heritage, or even you can expand to like arts and humanities and so forth, the methods and practices such as co-production or participatory approaches can help better understand these kind of core points of ways of knowing, ways of being, ways of living. They also help move towards this more holistic framework for tackling what you could arguably say is a wicked problem, the wicked problem of climate change, which is just really difficult to grasp and understand, and has so many different aspects and manifestations to it. We can help understand the complexity, the uncertainty, the motivations, the inertia, the value action gap that I mentioned of all other systems in place that kind of enable or disable action. So that project was basically the global. It was very high level recommendations, and it was very kind of while I wouldn't say it all, it was blue sky thinking that had very practical kind of pointers that people can use and grasp. There is always the question of just how do you turn this into practice? How do you operationalize it? How do you think about what this actually means besides being a publication where, you know, you're happy about like how many times it was cited or something like that. So, you know, we wanted to kind of like, how do we see this moving into practice? Or having an, I guess, some like more credible kind of implications. So following this project, so what we did is we shared, you know, obviously there were a lot of people involved, as I said, 100 or so worldwide. So various people kind of, you know, took concepts that that appealed to them and ran with it. And we certainly, our team, the core team, shared and presented a range of these iterations of our work. And there were some wins. So for example, at COP27, representatives from the project were there, they were attending. So on the slide, you can see the IPCC co-chair, Deborah Roberts. She's co-chair for the Working Package 3 of the IPCC, and she was a co-chair of the project as well. And then we had Climate Heritage Network, which is international network, Andrew Potts, and he was part of this panel for cultural heritage based climate solutions. And of course, while we cannot and won't take direct credit, of course, but at this COP, we saw the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan cover decision include cultural heritage for the first time. Following at COP28, there was the high-level ministerial on culture-based climate action the first event of this kind ever, which brought together ministers, political leaders, IGOs, as well as like cultural leaders, NGO stakeholders, and so forth. And at this ministerial, the ICSM, so the project was highlighted in the remarks from both the co-chair, the Minister of Culture, it was held at the UAE, and also by UNESCO representatives. And the resulting adoption of the Emirates Declaration on Culture-Based Climate Action actually gave an explicit nod to the project itself. So again, high level, but really making traction. And then lastly, and this was like exciting for us from a heritage background, but at the IPCC's 60th session, the work of the project was brought up and noted by the new chair as very close to the hearts of a lot of delegates. And actually it is attached as a supplement document on their website, which was really important for us to have kind of a non-heritage organization value and acknowledge and take to heart a lot of the messaging that we put in related to culture and heritage. Okay, so yeah, again, quite high level, but there have been other ways that the project has fed into practice-based research. I'm just going to kind of talk about one in particular with the last couple of minutes, but it fed into a water heritage project here in England, which focuses on communities and understanding knowledge systems as a kind of key part of building resilience. So, okay, these next slides are actually taken, or it's like stolen, from a presentation that I once saw years ago by someone called Giulio Boccialetti, who used to be the CEO for the Nature Conservatory a while back. They're now like a consultant. And it really stuck with me, so I wanted to share it with you here. So let's just start with what do I mean when I say water is a closed resource? So we don't actually think about it. And actually, to be honest, I was on an exhibition recently and I went to the toilet and on the door, it just said, water is a closed resource system. And I was like, of course it is. How interesting. So this is like my little Newton moment of just sitting somewhere and realizing this. But we don't think about it. And, you know, we pointlessly waste water in our households when we put the shower on and wait for the cold water or clean our cup by just randomly rinsing it, even though it's clean. But water is considered a closed resource on Earth because the water cycle operates as a closed system, meaning that the total amount of water on the planet remains relatively constant with no significant addition or loss of water. So yes, it changes state, you know, evaporates and is water and solid and ice, but that's it. So if you imagine, if you collect all the water we have on our Earth and you put it into one big bubble. So according to the CEO of the Nature Conservatory at the time, this is what you would have. And this is all of the water, so seawater mostly, obviously, with the salts and the debris and so forth, but not fresh water. So how much fresh water would we have if we look at it? And it's that little blue dot just below is how much fresh water we have. But 2/3 of that is locked in ice and ice sheets and so forth. And then 1/3 of that is locked as groundwater, which is effectively inaccessible. So if we think about it even further, how much do we have that's available for us to use? So yeah, it's that tiny dot, and this is, I mean, it's here, it's basically, I guess you could say this is what's taking from what he says, but this is basically to scale. And it's just about a reminder, a visual reminder that water is actually finite, and we simply don't have a lot of it. And, you know, it draws on the question of how we're doing in managing this finite resource. And I'd go to say not well at all. So if we look at the Living Planet Index, and this one is from quite a few years ago and developed by the WWF in partnership, I believe, with the IUCN, you can see that there's a huge drop in marine life. a drop of 40% or so. And meanwhile, for terrestrial animals, and also animals that depend on freshwater systems, we see even more massive, like shockingly massive declines. I guess we're used to seeing graphs like this these days. But for the freshwater animals that depend on freshwater, this is a 3/4 of a decline. So they're really shocking and visually shocking indicators of the health of our freshwater systems. And then, of course, there are other indicators of the profound water security issues that we see across the world. So, of course, flooding is an example. But then there's the death due to failures from flood control infrastructure, evacuations, huge destruction. This is just the recent ones that we saw in Spain. And then, of course, we see droughts, consequence of extreme aridity and dryness. And this, in turn, going back to our global challenges, cascades into other huge issues, such as poor air quality, problems with accessibility of resources, or other health and quality of life implications. And then this has huge implications on prosperity or like economic systems as well. So in short, water crisis is a massive issue. In fact, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report listed the water crisis among the top 10 risks in terms of impact every year from 2012, I think, all the way up to 2022, and probably even after that as well. But water is also listed as a top 10 risk in terms of long-term severity over the next decade. So it is clearly a huge issue. And so what does this have to do with us here? Britain is shaped by coasts. It is an island. Maritime nations naturally have long historic relationships with water and their coastlines through their social, economic, political, and environmental connections. And yet understanding water and water heritage is just full of complexity. It's a really understudied space due to but the complexities there's so much variety of communities, ecosystems, management systems, and that water space or coast being in a continuous state of flux. And the English coast alone varies from flat estuarine marshes to spectacular cliffs, and it's a water system with just so much history. Also, water resources are, of course, central to social economic activities, whether it's aquaculture, tourism, trade, transportation. So even though we're surrounded by water and water heritage, we manage it badly, we understand it badly. And even though there's successive governments are planning this plan for water, we really just don't understand it as much as we should, considering that we are an island. And its relationship to land, of course. So I'm just going to really briefly introduce, again, going from that really global and pulling it down to local. This is a project, Coast in Mind, which is a continued sort of new iteration of a very long project was known as Citizen. So Citizen was a national heritage lottery-funded citizen science project that went on for some 7 years and has now evolved to focus on knowledge systems and expertise within communities. But first, this photo is from Citizen. So in the pictures here, you see the team working on the East Kent coast, and they're recording the bygone traditional practices of fishing with fish stakes through the remains of archaeology. So those things are like fish traps found in the intertidal zone, so when the tide is low. But through that, we also learn about fishing practices, changes in biodiversity, coastal boundaries through the community itself, and individuals who might have been or witnessed this kind of bygone industry. And then here we have, because the project was national, we have Liverpool Bay, which had some prehistoric footprints found in the coastal sediment and revealed by coastal erosion. So of course, with coastal erosion, we see a lot of like exposed archaeology coming up. And maybe it's worth flagging the aim of Citizen, which stood for Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeology Network. So its primary aim was to record and study coastal change and work with communities and volunteers to record exposed archaeology or heritage at risk of being lost on the coast. So there is a lot of, again, like those hooks for having conversations with communities and understanding how they register and understand change. So in the process, we learned a lot from local communities, including how different communities respond to risk, heritage, and change, whether that change was to their social activities, livelihoods, work packages, or anything else like that. So after years of working with communities, but also looking at the archaeology, we began to recognize the sheer insights, knowledge, eyes and ears of local coastal communities on the ground. And so Coast and Mind came about from those insights, as well as a lot of lessons learned from my own work and the ICSM project that I mentioned earlier. And we decided to develop a project that would bring together intangible, tangible, cultural, natural heritage to co-create what we called a people's record of change at a local level through people's lived experiences and voices. And we would also triangulate that with that record with other existing databases, such as archives, historic environment records, and other relevant logs in local museums and so forth. And as a people-powered community engagement project, it works, as I said, with coastal communities to compile community heritage through those local experiences, images, documents, and accounts, people's personal memorabilia at home, and then use this to create like an open access and spatially mapped kind of community archive of local history that everyone can access. And it's really been great in also forging those, facilitating those intergenerational conversations related to change. So the archiving community is not, they are encouraging community connectedness. And there's a lot of like upskilling and training communities through different workshops and flexible learning and kind of investing in locally left behind communities to build this resilience, to kind of actually like empower them to have conversations with their local government representatives and basically enable them. And they do feel enabled to have the capacity like to inform local decisions and policies and add to existing coastal records such as environmental data sets and archive collections. So the Coast and Mind focuses on elder people, young people, and structurally disadvantaged people, and have they brought in over 30 partners from across sectors and localities to deliver the project. And it was also match funded. So through people being the eyes and ears of their environment, the team, as I was saying, co-developed a set of local indicators that helped map change, but also helped choose the places that I focus on. So here, just really quickly, archaeology or heritage, built or physical evidence left from people. So this could be anything from like a seawall or a ship or just anything basically, and it can even be a like single historical event. There's cultural use, so the kinds of activities people were involved in on the coast, whether it's recreation, coupling, fishing, so forth, biodiversity or wildlife, flora, fauna, seagrasses, oyster species, changes of oyster species being like huge if there's offshore wind farms, migratory birds, all these different things. As tide line, so positions of high, low, mid-tide and how that's changed. Land surface, the sediment characteristic of the foreshore, whether it's shingle, sand, mud, and then foreshore features. So these kind of like physical features, whether it's like dunes, cliffs, salt marshes, islands, creeks, and so forth. And just looking, using those tangible things as indicators for change. So yeah, using those already, the team began compiling a kind of archive of local knowledge through people and their oral histories and memorabilia, which provides, again, that community voice of what's changing in their lives and livelihoods through lived experiences, memories, personal belongings, stories, and that understanding of what they see as risk and uncertainty within their own lifetimes. So yeah, you see through the images just the levels of change. And meanwhile, there are opportunities to contribute and co-develop research and address change in communities. And like I said, working with, there is a lot of local government representatives who were very eager to reach out to the communities as well. Okay, so the Coastal Mine Project is a very quick example of like one, thinking about a global problem and making it relevant to the local. Coastal communities are most vulnerable to climate impact across the world, and just like understand the impact at a local level better than anyone else. And then, of course, second, like rethinking climate risk and what it actually means to local communities, how they understand change, how they see change and experience it. And then and lastly, like exploring ways for locally led adaptation through culture and heritage. And for us, this project feeds into many of the gaps and issues that are emerging with kind of climate change considerations. So it not only highlights the importance of water heritage, coastal communities, ties between land and water, whether that's like systems or health, and those sorts of like conceptual trains of thought, but it also helps understand how to build capacity, empower communities, enable local democracy, and think about knowledge as a critical resource and infrastructure for positive change. And I think the last, I'm on time, is great stuff. So I have a video, which I am not sure whether oh, maybe I can press it. And it's just 3 minutes, so I'm going to go with it. So I'm just going to leave you with this, if it clicks. And just in an attempt to satiate your appetite, it's the first of 14 videos that were made for COP26 about sharing your climate heritage story. And it is all about kind of coastal work in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But also just to say kind of the Coast and Mine Project has officially launched as of last week, their website. So it's a great opportunity to check them out in detail. So let's see if I can get this to play. All right, I think I'm done.
No, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for contributing today. And yeah, see you soon. Right, great.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Bye.